part of working with arrays is working with for loops. We can use a for loop with an array when? When can we use a for loop with an array? If we know how many elements, okay? So if we know the array is full, then we can use a for loop and that size. Now in this particular example, we have a file that has a list of names. That list of names could be empty. It could be 30 names. It could be 100 names, okay? So in this particular example, I've allocated space for 50 names because that's the maximum size that I've decided for whatever reasons, okay? I've declared a temporary variable that's a string that I'm going to read the name in from the file, okay? And then I've created a counter called numNames, which I initialized to 0. Assuming I've opened the file, I'm going to read the first name into temp name, this temporary name, okay? I've set up a while loop that's going to read until what again? What does while in file mean? So long as there's a valid record in the file. Basically, it means while not end of file. The second condition for the while loop means what? What does the second condition mean? So long as I haven't counted more than 50 names into the file. Okay, so right now, what is numNames? 0, so we know it's less than 50. Okay. So if I get here, then I know it was a good read. I'm going to take the name that I read in and store it at name sub 0. Everybody with me? Stop me if you have a question, okay? What is this guy doing? Bumping the counter to say I now have one name, okay? I read in the next guy from the file, check to see if it was a good read, and check to see if I have room in the array. And I store the value that I read in into name sub 1. I bump it and read again, and so when I get all through, we decided that I know that how many names I read from the file because the value is going to be inside numNames. So if I wanted to print all the names moving forward, I don't go from I to 50 because most likely I've not read in 50 names, agreed? I've read in numNames, okay? So I'm going to use a loop that goes from I to numNames. And that'll print the appropriate numbers. Does anybody have questions about that so far? So if you look at the exercise, we do have reading from a file, excuse me, which is the same idea, but instead I used IX rather than numNames. So if you look at the reading from a file example on page 5, it lists the same example, okay? So I want you to do number 1. Write a solution to read up to 100 numbers from the user and store it in an array. So the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to declare an array of numbers that can store 100 elements. You cannot use a for loop with this because how many values might the user enter? 100 or less, okay? We're not going to allow them to do less than 100, okay? Now, let's not worry about counting the number of positive and negative integers yet. I want you just to read in up to 100 numbers from the user and store it into an array. So what kind of loop are you going to have to use? Well, okay, so go ahead and exercise number 1. Read in 100 numbers. So use a while loop and go ahead and set it up for exercise number 1. Numbers from the user and storing in an array, up to 100 numbers. So we need 2 conditions. What is the first condition? What are the 2, who can give me the 2 conditions? Nadia? Okay. Okay, let's do it something else besides nums. I'm going to call it count. Okay? So that means that what should the second condition be? What's that? Well, we're not using a file. This time we're getting it from the user, and 0 quits. Okay, so while num is not equal to 0. Agreed? Not nums, because nums is the array. I'm going to use this temporary variable. Okay? So now how do I initialize this condition prior to the loop? Yep. And then how do I initialize this condition? Everybody knows this. How do I do it? How do I initialize the entering a number stopping at 0? So what do I do here? See out. And I'm just going to read this into, I could read it into the array, but for now I'm just going to read it into a separate one. Okay. So I read in a number. So if I get here, what should I do? What should I do with the number that I read in? Somebody help me. Do you know what to do? I read in num. It's not a 0, so what should I do with it? I'm hearing somebody say it. Are you saying it? Okay. Go ahead, Abel. Okay, well, I'm going to put, this is the array. Right? That takes the value the single value that I read in and puts it into the array at the 0th location. So I just made one num and one num. That's why I like to use plural for the array. Does everybody see what I did? So I read it into a variable. If it's not equal to 0, then I'm going to put it into the array. Does that make sense? Ask me a question if you have, okay? So my two conditions were it's not 0 and I have room in the array. If those are not both valid, or if I have a good number and I have room, I put it into the array. You with me? Okay, so then what do I do next? What shall I do to restart this loop? I will do that. That's one of the steps. Who said it? Count plus plus. So I want to do this. You with me? So now this will work. This will read in values from the user, store them in the array, and now what it wants me to do, it wants me to print the numbers back to the screen. Ideas how I would print the numbers back to the screen now. What should I do now if I want to now print the numbers back to the screen? What can I use? And what else? What kind of loop? Question? Okay, so I use count in here as I was reading them in. Okay? So what's in count when I'm finished with this? How many I read in. So I don't want to lose that number. So I'm going to restart it. I'm going to use count. This is actually wrong. I'm going to fix this in a second. But I don't want to reuse count because count is telling me how many I read in. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's watch this and let's first of all see what's wrong with this. Okay, so I'm going to enter a couple numbers. And let's see what it printed. Well, the first couple were right, but why is this all this crap in all the rest of the guys? Somebody explain to me why there's a bunch of junk in this array. Yes. Less than what? Okay, count. Whatever I use for count. Does everybody see the problem here? I allocated space for 100. I put 5, 6, 7, and 8 in the array. The rest of it just wasn't initialized, so it's just garbage that was there. But I printed all 100. How many did I actually want to print? The 4, which that number is this guy right here. That's where I did the count. So if I use count, that's how many values are in that array now. Look better? Does that look better? So the point here is, I don't know what you call it, but the size of the array and the number of elements you read in are probably not the same thing. Does that make sense? It's kind of a disadvantage of C arrays because they're static. C++ arrays are static. You're stuck with the size. And if you don't use the whole array, you have to keep track of that size that you read in and use that subsequently, not the maximum size. Otherwise, you're going to have all kinds of garbage values if you try to average and things like that, right? Okay, does that make sense? Okay.